Hello, thank you for being with us today for a very meaningful program I've been so excited about with Oskar Singer and his daughter Lee Fischbach. Oskar Singer was born in Radomish Wielki, Poland in 1925, and he's forgiving me my Polish pronunciation, so thank you for that. As a teen and young adult, Oskar survived imprisonment and forced labor in multiple camps, including Plaszow, Theresienstadt, and Auschwitz camps. Following the end of the war, he was held in a displaced persons camp. After receiving his visa to come to the United States in 1951, he eventually settled in Denver, Colorado. He married, had 2 children, and had a successful career in the restaurant and catering business for many years. A few years ago, Oskar relocated to Pittsburgh to live with his daughter, Lee Fischbach, who will be joining us today to tell their story. And Lee and Oskar, I can't thank you enough for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Lauren. We're very glad to be here. As Lauren said, my name is Lee Fischbach, and I'm here to introduce my father, Oskar Singer. My father was born in 1925 in Radomish Wielki. It was a little village with 300 families in the south of Poland. The Jewish people made up of 75% of the townspeople, and they lived in the Galicia region. As you can see in the presentation, this is a picture of my father, which I have here, the original. And this picture has always been on my piano. And when I was a little girl, I always thought it was perfectly normal that there was 2 pictures of my father, one in a prison uniform and one without. And this picture was taken by a Russian soldier after he was released from Theresienstadt. And as many survivors' children will attest, it's always been a very normal part of your life. And it always seemed normal to me until some of my American friends pointed out why I did have this picture on my piano. And this has always been a part of our life. And it's something that I'm very glad to share today. He had 3 brothers, Jacob, Alter, Abraham, and 1 little sister, Rachel. His first language was Yiddish, which is a combination of both German and Hebrew. He spoke Polish when he went to school, and his family were the kosher butchers of the village and were very religious. And like most everyone in the village were very poor. There was no train station, doctor, or dentist. Every Sabbath, people would come to his family home, and my grandfather would give townspeople and the rabbi meat for their Shabbat table. Shabbat was a magical time for the family, just like you would have seen in Fiddler on the Roof. However, the first time my dad saw the movie, he said nothing ever looked like that. He never saw a home that rich or large in a village. His home was a little cottage with stone floors, 4 rooms, and with kindling wood on the roof. Daddy, is there anything you'd like to say about your home in Radomish Wielki? No. Okay.
You got it pretty good.
Okay. His father was very religious and was one of the only 5 siblings that stayed in Poland. There were so many pogroms, killings, and anti-Semitism over the years that his father's brothers and sisters could not take it anymore, and they left for America or Shanghai before World War II. Unfortunately, we've lost contact with any, if not all of them. And one day, perhaps with Ancestry.com or 23andMe, we might be able to find someone of my dad's family. Daddy's father, Joshua, believed that the Mashiach, the Messiah, would come and end the suffering. And this is what he always told the boys during the worst times of the war. When times were bad, his father told him to recite a Hebrew prayer, the Shir Hamalot, when there were bad times. And my dad, throughout the years 1939 to 1945, there were horrible times. And when my father was incarcerated as a prisoner, my father and his brother Abraham would pray silently, just like his father told him, to say the Shir Hamalot prayer. And this gave my dad hope as he was reminded of his father's kindness and love every day and prayed for the suffering to end, for him and for everyone. The Germans came to my daddy's village September 1939, at the very beginning of the war, when he was 14 years old, and the Germans were able to defeat the Polish armies within days of occupation. Germany crossed into Poland at 4:45 a.m., and Daddy's older brother Jacob was a Polish soldier and was the only one, unfortunately, in the village that was killed in the tank war near Warsaw. Oscar's family was, of course, devastated by the news, but their only solace would be that Jacob would be spared the humiliation and terror that the Nazis would rain upon the remaining family members. In 1939, as soon as the war began and as soon as the Nazis took over the village, they terrorized and began looting, humiliating Jewish people on the street, beating them up, rounding out the young boys and forcing them to work for them. One time my dad's father was praying, and the Germans caught him and beat him up. The Germans would not tolerate any private or public Jewish praying. The Germans told the Jewish boys in the village that if they would willingly work for them, they would spare their families. So there was the moral dilemma. Do we do that, save our families, or do we run away to the forest, which is something that he and his two brothers were going to do. However, they chose not to do that because they were told, and at the time, no one would have ever imagined what would have happened after 1941. So they did so with the promise of the Nazis and the boys' responsibility to their parents and their younger sister. They turned back, and then they submitted to slave labor. Every day they were taken by the Nazis and taken with rubber hoses and taken to a forest to have to clear the woods and make everything right. So when more of the tanks would come in, they needed more of a clearing. He and all the Jews in the village were at that time forced to wear the Jewish star armband. And from September 1939 until 1941, the Nazis would grab Oscar and his brothers on the street or knock on the door. And every day they were forced to work in the forest, cutting trees, stones, carrying logs, and clearing open space in Paskov Forest. Now, these are actual pictures of Radomish Bielki, which I did visit years later, and of the village and what was happening in 1939 to 45. The Gestapo or the SS would hit them hard with the rubber whips or hoses so they would move faster and faster, and the Jewish workers were beaten just because they were Jewish. They had minimal food, worked in freezing conditions, and performed slave labor, which consisted of constant terrorizing and death by the Nazis, threatenings, life threatenings, beatings, and they knew they had to succumb, as many of the people knew at that time. Even at the very beginning, it never went to the point that it would go for the killing camps, but being with the Nazis and working with the Nazis at the beginning was very, very difficult. In 1941, when he was 14, Oscar and his brothers, Alter and Abraham, were forced from the family, and they were forced to leave the family. The work was done at Paskov Forest, and then they were forced to go to Mielec airplane factory. And they worked in the airplane factory as best as they could. They were untrained laborers. My dad, I don't know if you want to show him, if you want to show the KL, and there's only 2,500 people, I believe, in the world that have this KL. And that was something that, in case they would run away, the Polish people, the remaining, oh, Daddy, I don't know if you want to show him, there, see, he has his KL. The Polish Christian boys were allowed to go home every night. The Jews were not any longer allowed to go home, and, only the Jewish boys had the KL tattooed on their arm, so that if they ran away, they would be found very quickly and they would return back to work. So the Jewish boys were thrown into trucks, moved into dirty, crowded barracks in Mielec, and they were never allowed to come home again. At the beginning, my dad was able to get letters from his Christian friends that would bring news of his family, and he would know that they were safe. However, after a while, those letters stopped coming, and he never really knew what happened to his family after that point. So he worked in Mielec, which was an airplane factory where they made German bombers and manufactured the fighter plane HE-297. My dad was always a big, brawny guy, and he had difficult working with the little airplane parts. So many times they thought he was a saboteur, and the Nazis beat him and threatened to kill him. One day, someone was smart enough to move him to another part of the factory, and he began to carry the airplane parts on his shoulders while the Nazis would scream the obscenities and hit him with a rubber hose or a whip so that he would move faster and faster. His younger brother, Abraham, was thin and tall and agile and was very adept at assembling the airplane parts. He was spared Oscar's backbreaking work, but later the constant proximity with the glue and chemicals would hurt his lungs and weaken him. His older brother, Alter, worked in the farms at Mielec. So there was farms and there was the airplane factory. One day, my dad and Abraham and his brother came home from work, and they were told by the fellow prisoners that their older brother, Alter, was injured on the farm and was shot by the Nazis. So now it was just the two brothers clinging for life and praying for escape. One time, the Jewish prisoners did plan an escape in the middle of the night. Everyone was ready, even though they had the KLR in their arms. They felt they had nothing to lose. They were young. They knew things were not going to get any better for them. However, someone overheard the Jewish prisoners, and the Nazis were waiting for them at the gates. Every day after that, the Nazis, there was an appel, which was a roll call at 6 a.m. in the morning, where the Jewish prisoners were left outdoors in the freezing cold for hours. So if one of the Jewish prisoners had escaped in the middle of the night, the Nazis would grab 10 Jewish prisoners and immediately shoot them in front of the other Jewish prisoners. So at that point, every day there were hangings and there were shootings because someone had tried to escape, and whether or not they were close or not, you needed to threaten them with as much horror as you could so that you could keep them in line. In Mielec, as I said, my father was tattooed with the KL, which means concentration lager, which is German for concentration camp. My dad told me that the Nazis would be standing over them, is that correct, with their German shepherds, and they had better not wince or complain when they were being tattooed, or they would have the dogs savagely bite and mauling them. However, there was times he was tired. He didn't want to look at you didn't like your KL, and he wanted to get rid of it, but he couldn't. After the war, he was able to get rid of his numbers, but he could never get rid of the KL because it was tattooed so deeply into his skin. Consequently, my dad many times wears long sleeves so that people won't ask him questions about his tattoo, especially when tattoos were not fashionable in the 70s and 80s. So he doesn't have, and also that he doesn't have to look at the KL, start staring at him all day long. In mid-1943, after the year and a half or so at Mielec, and he and Abraham were then forced to work at Wieleczka salt mine. And right now, Wieleczka is a World Heritage Site, which is very interesting. Then I went to visit it, and the lady who was living there all of her life, she had told me that, oh, we're so proud because this beautiful salt mine never had slave labor. And I raised my hand and I said, well, that's not really true. There was slave labor. My dad was there, and she kept insisting there was no slave labor. Finally, she took me aside after the troop had left and told me that yes, there might have been slave labor, but there was Jewish engineers that worked there. And I assured her my father was 16 years old. There's no way he was a Jewish engineer, and that there had been slave labor there. And my dad said it was one of the worst times of the war. Was it not? Remember? Could you say a little bit about it?
Was it the call like a salt mine? What is there just to go down there? All we were doing is cleaning. We saw the salt coming in, and we were working the things to the whole salt mine till we leave the work.
But you were afraid every morning. You didn't know if you were coming in, coming out.
We didn't know where we coming and things like that. You just do what you can do the best. You always have to do it. Otherwise, they stay with a gun with you, and you can get killed then. So you have to do what things that you think.
Okay, sure. That was a horrible experience where they would be transported at gunpoint in a pitch black shaft and work from morning to night mining salt. They never knew if they were going to live or die, as Daddy said. But then they were only there about 6 to 8 weeks, and he was very fortunate. And then in late 1943, Abraham and Oscar were transported via Wieleczka to Auschwitz concentration camp. And the trains that they were transporting were in the cattle cars that we've all seen on television. And there was no water, no food, nowhere to go to the bathroom. When they finally arrived at Auschwitz, they were filthy, hungry, thirsty, tired, and emotionally and physically exhausted, which was exactly how the Nazis would have wanted them. At that point, they had nothing left, and they would do whatever they were told. No sooner that they were forced off the cattle cars like animals, the selections began. The older people, children, and people not suitable for work were sent to pack their belongings as if they were going to return for them. They were told that if they were going to be taking a shower, and the Nazis used the Zyklon B and poisoned them with the deadly gas and killed everyone. And it was the job of the Jewish prisoners to remove them from the poisoned showers and bring the bodies to the crematoriums. And if you were lucky enough to be selected for work that Daddy was, you had a number tattooed on your arm, and you were assigned to the work detail. Abraham, his brother, was unfortunately separated from Oscar, and Abraham stayed the entire time at Plaszow concentration camp, which is very close, as many of you have been there, to to Oskar Schindler's factory. But Abraham worked at a factory because, as we said earlier, he was very adept at his hands. But however, Oskar was allowed to live, but what he was chosen, because as I said, he was a big, brawny guy, and he lived in a rundown shack in a forest, and it was halfway between Plaszow and Auschwitz. And he worked for the Nazis in inhumane, terrifying, and horrifying conditions, and once again, he had to make a decision. Does he continue to live and try to be with his brother, his younger brother, which he felt responsible for, and maybe his parents and sister would be alive, or does he just give up? He chose to live, and he chose to survive, and that decision he has to make every day. And Oskar and his fellow prisoners would sleep during the day, and every evening they would be transported to Chojova Gorka. And I actually saw that. It's in between Plaszow and Auschwitz. And then they would be forced to go to the killing field. It's a hill where people had just been shot, and then he would take the gold from people's teeth. And many of the people that were, every day the Nazis would kill at least of Oskar's fellow Jewish prisoners who were forced to work in this detail, as some of the prisoners were not emotionally or physically strong enough to do the work, and they would faint or just beg to be shot. They would rather just be shot. My dad has told me several times that these were not necessarily the Jewish prisoners. These were the intelligentsia, the people that went against the Nazis from different parts of the country.
From all countries, from Germany, from Poland, from Russia, from Ukraine, that came in all over the eastern countries. They brought it in, even from Holland. Everything.
So this was a special area that they did not go directly to Auschwitz. It was a special area where they took visits of people every night.
For 6 weeks.
And so the gold fillings and teeth would be placed in boxes, and then the Nazis would gather the gold for their war machine. And as many of you know, every part of the murdered prisoners' bodies would be repurposed: clothes, shoes, hair for mattresses, and the defenseless human beings were used for gruesome medical experiencing. And the repurposing jobs were mostly done by the Jews that had to, and they were forced to grapple with their mortality and morality, as Oskar did, every moment of the day, and they had to decide if they could go on and be killed by the Nazis. The one thing that saved my dad and made his decisions to go forward and to keep working even though he was hungry and starved, and he always hoped that he would see his parents and sister again, and so he felt that if he prayed and believed in God, that the war and everyone's suffering would end. So after 6 weeks in that unit, he was returned to Plaszow concentration camp. And he worked as a slave laborer, packing and carrying parts throughout the factory until mid-1944. Oskar was transported from Plaszow concentration camp to Auschwitz by Dresden tank factory. And luckily enough, he had been reunited with his brother, which gave him a will to live, because he got to be with his brother one more time, and being older. And it was important for him to be with his brother and for them to be together moving forward and hoping that the war would end. He worked in the tank factory, hauling parts from one place to another, and he cleaned parts, throwing parts away. And then he also was lucky enough to work in the kitchen, which basically saved his life. And if many of you have read survivor stories, you know that if you were ever lucky enough to be in the vicinity of food, that would save your life, and it would keep you a little bit stronger than you would otherwise be with the meager soup that they would give you and maybe a piece of bread a day. And he worked in the kitchen, which probably saved his life, as he would stuff food in his mouth when the Nazis weren't looking. One time, he was bringing potatoes for his brother Abraham and their cellmates that Oskar had stolen to give to them from the kitchen. His brother was weak, his cellmates were weak, he could only eat so much at a time, and he felt it was his job to share with whatever he could. Unfortunately, one of the Nazis saw him take the potato, and he had the dogs ferociously bite him in the leg. And Oskar still has a part of his leg that is badly scarred where the dogs bit him. However, once again, luck would intervene, and instead of getting it infected, because as you know, there was nowhere to go, there was no infirmary, it did not get infected, and he was able to continue working. And whereas I don't believe you stole food anymore, because it was they knew what he would do, at least he was able to save his brother and his cellmates for as long as he could. And in early 1945, the war was going badly for the Germans. And even though there was no radios, there was nothing, you knew the war was going badly by the way they treated you or...
A little better they treated, but they didn't have any transportation anymore. We had to walk. There was no buses to go to work and all kinds of problems.
And in early 1944...
And to help the German people who worked in the tank factory, they say that they have troubles with the war there.
Oh, so he would overhear what some of the German fellow workers would, the paid workers would say.
They knew they had troubles.
So in early 1945, the Germans were moving farther and farther west to get away from the Russians. And you knew a little bit of what was going on, but not that much.
Later when we were walking.
Right, and then the prisoners were forced to walk in the middle of the winter for those 2 to 3 weeks to reach Theresienstadt. So Daddy was on the death march, and like he said, he knew things were changing for the Germans because he saw the American fighter planes, Americans and Russians.
There was a bridge there from Auschwitz to Theresienstadt, a big bridge, and they saw us walking, and they didn't soon we went by the bridge, then they started bombing the bridge.
Right, so they saw all the prisoners in their uniforms, and they chose not to bomb them then, and they waited until the bridge was so that the Germans could not go back and retreat. Unfortunately, many people, as you know from history, did die in that march. It was frozen tundra. It was horrible, and there was no food. And unfortunately, many of them, including his brother Abraham, died on the march. So Daddy had to choose whether or not he would go forward or not. He chose once again that he would move forward and look for his parents after the war. So all of the time that Abraham had worked in the airplane factory had really severely damaged his lungs. In one hand, he was lucky enough to have an easier job than Daddy did, but then on the other side, that's what eventually killed him with all the chemicals and lungs and chemicals and glues that he used. So many of the prisoners on the road were starved, beaten, or frozen to death. As Oscar and the prisoners were walking, Daddy will always tell me some of the people in the villages along the way would throw rocks at them. However, some of the kinder townspeople would throw beets or potatoes for them to eat. And he's always told me there's always two kinds of people, one that will throw you a potato and the other one will throw you a stone. And if the Nazis didn't see the food, the prisoners would eat the contraband food as fast as they could. And my daddy was always grateful for everyone's kindness. And he always felt that in life, you could make these choices, and the choices that you have to make are the choices that will influence somebody else's life in the future, and always try to be the one that throws the beets or the potatoes instead of throwing the rocks at someone. Once in Theresienstadt, Oscar cleaned the streets, latrines, barracks. Many of the concentration camps were opened up and they were sent to Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was a very overcrowded place at that time. And at that time, the Nazis knew they had to kill the people that were there because they did not want there to be any stories or any people like Daddy here to talk to. So my dad was actually building his own crematoriums, and as he'll always say, it was just 4 days from completion. What the Nazis would have used on all of them, so we would not be here today, and there would be no history, and there would be no survivors left to tell their story. Luckily, that didn't happen. The Russians liberated them on May 10th, 1945 at 4 a.m. and told the prisoners that they were free. And as you all know, the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe were destroyed. However, he was one of the lucky ones, and he went, after the war, he went to Landsberg displaced camp. And luckily, there were Russians there who could speak Yiddish. There was American soldiers that could speak Yiddish. And they tried their best to talk to him. And they worked with the Red Cross to try to find any memory or any family member that he could have met. He did meet one family member, Cousin Herschel, who was older than he was. And unfortunately, Cousin Herschel lost his wife and his 2 daughters. And he was older, about 10 years, so he was not in the kind of place where he could move forward. Daddy, on the other hand, was able to move forward, and he and his 3 friends went to Munich, Germany.
Only 60 kilometers.
And they ended up at Landsberg displaced persons camp. And that was as best as they could do. The Allies did not know what to do with all these people, but my dad did not want to stay there very long. He was young. And he wanted to move forward with his life, and he and his 3 friends, they went to Munich And well, first they went home. What he did, originally what Daddy did was in Theresienstadt, he and his friend Max, his best friend, not knowing what had happened to anyone or anyone after the war, he and his friend went back to Max's home, which is what was his house. And what was that place called?
Radikosh.
Radikosh. And he actually ended up in Radikosh. And so the two of them went back, didn't tell anybody where they were going, and they went back and they saw someone who used to work for him. It was a big farm, and they went back to the farm and asked the man who used to work for Max, did my dad leave anything? And the man came back and said, let me see. Yes, he did. So he came back out with a shotgun and he shot Max right in front of my father. And he said, we don't want you Jews. We don't want you to come home. The Germans gave us your property. They belong to us. And my father said he will never go back to his home, and he never did. Even though he did remember that some kind friends of my father's grandfather did say that they would keep some of the Shabbat candlesticks and a pearl necklace of the mother and some collectibles. But my father never went to collect them and see if they still had them. And to this day, we don't know what happened to them. But he swore he would never go back, and he never has. So he did stay with his cousin at Landsberg for a few weeks, and then he wanted to go to Israel. And he did go. Right, in 1946, he did board a ship for Israel, but he was stopped by the English, and he ended up in another camp in Cyprus. And at that time, he didn't know anything about anything. There was no Israel. There was nothing like that. And he had already been in enough camps. He didn't want to stay in another one. And the Italian Red Cross were very kind, and they came and asked him if they wanted to return back to Italy, which he did. And he returned back to Italy, and then he found his way back to Munich, where he stayed until 1951, where he was offered a visa. He did find that it takes a very long time. He could have gone to Australia. He could have gone to lots of places, but he wanted to go to America. 1949. He wanted to go back to America, or to go to America. He heard he had a cousin there, and he wanted to go back and start his life there. Dad is one of the lives that was spared. And Oscar believes that he is here today by the grace of God, to try and make the world a better place, and to practice our acts of everyday kindness, and to share his history. The most important lesson that my father taught me was that the Nazis could steal their food, your hair, your clothes, and all your worldly possessions. However, as much as they tried, Oscar would never let them steal his humanity. And everyone has a choice to choose humanity over evil, and to choose hope, forgiveness, and love, or darkness, violence, racism, and brutality. My father embodies what is right in this world, and he will always be my inspiration, and I appreciate you letting me share his story with you.
Lee and Oscar, let me thank you so much for telling that story. And Lee, I really love where you ended it, because I have been lucky enough to interact with Oscar a number of times, and what you say is exactly true. Oscar, you are such a kind person, and so open and receptive to other people with very different experiences. You bring so much to every encounter we've had with you at the Holocaust Center. And I want everyone who's listening to this to know that indeed you are a beacon of hope, spreading a message of love. And it's such a remarkable thing, especially hearing this story, and how in your experience in the Holocaust, Oscar, you went through some of the most horrific things a person could go through.
Only one thing I can tell you, I couldn't tell you that what she can talk, mostly in English, and I could break out with cry, you just don't want to talk so much. It's hard to say for me that.
Yes.
My daughter took it over. When she was a little girl, she started to write and what's going on there. She didn't even know what. She knows a little bit, but not after 8-9 years. And my wife didn't like to talk about it because she is born and raised in Illinois. See? And they had troubles in Illinois too when she went to Northwestern. It's got cold. Every place is troubles.
So Lee, how did you learn the story? Is it something that your father talked about when you were growing up, or did you develop the story that you tell later? Can you tell us what that process was like?
Sure. As a little girl, I always knew it was a little odd that I didn't have any relatives, and that, from my father's side of the family. And I knew that when I always had long hair. My dad would always pull my hair back and always say, "Oh, you look just like my sister, Rachel." But then every time he would say that, he would start to cry. And whereas I loathed my freckles, he, always said, "Oh, freckles are so sweet. My sister had all those beautiful freckles." And then I would feel a little bit closer to his family. So there was always this positive reinforcement that if I could ask a few questions every once in a while, I might get a few answers. They would be very short answers because he would start to cry, because I was born in 1958. So it was really only 14 years after the war. And it was still, or 13 years, and it was still very, very raw. But finding out information from my dad was a lifelong process. So yes, and because he could only take telling me so much, and I think he was afraid to hurt me and to hear about these sad things. Why did you never tell me anything?
Because it was a very bad thing. He couldn't say, you don't want to tell him what I went through after the war. We had to work. People, when they shoot the people, I had to take the gold teeth out. That was hard there.
Terrible.
And then in the 90s, we saw these boxes. They came to Switzerland. So there was the whole story.
On the gold for the teeth and the gold.
Yeah,
gold.
Right. That's what it is. And they worked together. It was a neutral country. How that worked, I don't know. Just, you don't want to talk about it.
Well, it's an important point. We continue to learn about what happened during the Holocaust. This is not a history where the book is closed. There's a lot more to learn. And in the story that you were telling, we heard a number of things about Poland during the war, immediately after, when you tried to go home, and even how the history is told now.
When I heard that, I never wanted to go home anymore. I didn't want to look for anything. I took my friend over there. He wants to see his range. In 10 minutes, he killed him. That's why we were burying him in Dombrova, at a little town there. And then I went to the Russian things, and they say, you should have come over to us before. So how did we know? We were little boys.
You did the best you could.
I was going to say, and there was no guarantee that would have changed the outcome for anyone.
That's true, too. That's a good point.
That's at that time. It comes across in your story, and it's important for people who are not so familiar with the history of the Holocaust to understand the risk at every turn, the choices that you had to make that really weren't choices. But Lee talked about, Oscar, the choice that you made every day to go on living.
That's right.
And it's such an important thing for people to hear, that even in those circumstances, you made a choice every day, and you continue to make a choice to go on living. So for students who are hearing this, what would you like them to take from that?
The only thing I can tell you, you can be nice. You can be nice to people, what's going on, and you still have to live with the hope. Everything is going to be changing, and there is a God to help us. We have to believe in God. That's the main thing. And you have to pray a little bit too. I live whenever you have time. I know people have to work, and we have to do what we can do. There's a lot in the Bible tells you all the things that you have to be nice. You can't kill anybody. You have to do the things that you have to protect the people. That's the way it goes. It's what's going on. This is all politics, all shit. Who knows what's going on?
It's an important message what you just said right now.
And I am not the only,
please, I don't want to interrupt you, please.
I said, I'm not the only one who went through. There's a lot of other people, whatever it is, a few million people, whoever's left over, they know about it. Some of them don't live anymore. God, let me live every day. We hope to God every day that you think that you have to be nice and to people. You have to hurt people. You got to do a nice living and work your life, and that's it.
It's such a timely message when we're seeing what's happening around the world right now, and in this country where we've had now 6 weeks of protests for the Black Lives Matter movement, and we're confronting systemic racism in our own country. Do you have any thoughts about that? Do we learn anything from the Holocaust that's important for people to know?
The Holocaust will tell you because they do the same thing here too. They do people fighting for anything, even in Israel or Middle East. Look, all the Jews, what they were going through now over there. They don't have an easy life. They're running into a gate or something and go kill people. For what? For nothing. Because they're Jews.
And it would be the same thing here. Systemic racism is never right. It was wrong in World War II. It's wrong to keep people down in any society, and it's a way to steal people's livelihoods, and whatever. If they can become better, you take it away from them. Their hopefulness and their chance. And we do need to not hate people based on their color or their religion, and that would be the most takeaway from his experience, I would think.
That's correct.
I have a couple questions going back to what you talked about. First of all, I don't know if people were able to see your tattoo, and I'm sorry to bring that up again because that's a very painful subject. There it is.
Can you see it?
That means concentration camp. The reason they put it on because we were able to get away, walk away to the doors. When they watch you, who you are, then they can see right away.
Oh, you mean when his Polish friends would go back to the village, he couldn't go along with them, so that it would be very obvious.
That's correct. And then make it that you don't walk away easy. All you get underarm, you can see that you are. Everybody who went in there had.
But only the Jewish people got it.
Only the Jewish people who worked there. And
your Christian friends did not get it.
No, the Christians in there, they have a number. Like you're going
ID badge. My dad also had a number from Auschwitz that he had originally, but he had taken that off after the war. He did not want to look at that anymore.
I thought that the war, after the German lost, that the war, nobody wants to see this and that. Everything is forgettable. But
you didn't want to see it either, did you?
No,
did you want to look at your number? Because he tried to get the KL taken off, as I said earlier, but they said it was too deep. I even asked the dermatologist. That's correct. I even asked a dermatologist a few months ago. I thought, it's never too late for anything. My dad's only 95, and he's always talked about getting rid of this. And I asked her, and she said no. She's never seen anything so deep. In fact, she was so surprised, the dermatologist, that it was as bright as it was. Usually people have to re-ink their bodies to get to that level of brightness. And she said it must have been immensely painful after 60-some years. No, what am I saying? After 70, 80 years to have that still be such a vibrant and deep tattoo.
Also in the 80s and the 70s, I used to have, in the summertime, I used to have a car accident. My wife was with me in a grocery store or something. We called the police, and there was a guy there that says, "Oh, I know what that is. This is tattoos what they have. It's one of those, so that's all." They even that taught you that when you got tattoos, lots of people.
Oh, they thought you were a biker.
Right.
Oh, okay.
So they really wanted it. But what you're going to do is keep it covered, the things. And when it's hot, and when you work in your kitchen, I always was a cook. I like food, and I still like food. I have a big mouth. That's all in the world. So we have to be keeping up the best you can.
So this is one of my favorite parts of the story that we didn't hear yet, and I said that we would save it for now, but we heard that after the war, you moved around a bit between a displaced persons camp in Munich, and you went on a boat to get into the British mandate. You were turned away and sent to Cyprus.
I didn't have anybody. We went to displaced person. We get that. I'm going to wait for 4 years. I have to advance myself. Then you had to wait 4 or 5 years for a visa. I put in a visa to come to the United States. And I had no choice. And that's to do with it.
So what is your question? I'm sorry?
I'm marveling at really the whole history, and that, Oscar, that you experienced so many of the things that people hear about. Rarely one person experienced all of them. But I know that at one point you went back to Italy, from Cyprus to Italy. And is that where you got involved with Italian cooking?
I went back to Munich, Germany, because I went back where I belonged, and I went back to the things, the friends.
So how long were you in Italy?
We were worked there.
How long were you in Italy?
I went around 3 months, something like that, 2 or 3 months.
And so then, is that where you started to cook, or were you already cooking?
No. I started to cook. I started cooking chocolates by Dresden in my last tank factory camp. Okay. What I want to do, because I was very bad in mechanic like my brother, every time I put in things that didn't go too far, fall out or scratch it. I couldn't do it. I can even change a tire. Even now, I don't know how to change a tire. My wife doesn't let me. She never did. She said the car is going to fall out on you. And that's the way it does. Then I went to the kitchen, and I said, I'll do anything you do. So they put me in the kitchen and peeling potatoes and these things. At least I can eat. So I like the food. And then I helped my brother to things that not too long. Then they caught me. I got the potatoes, took home for them a few potatoes. Didn't do any good. They caught me, and I had troubles for that too. But I went through, and I was working in the kitchen. And when I came, I want to be a cook. What are you going to do? I never had a profession, never every place I worked there. So I wanted to be a cook. So I went to, in Germany, I don't know if you've ever been in Germany, they call it the Lebenbarkeller, 17. They say you have to wash dishes. I said, I don't care, I'll do anything.
Just after the war.
After the war, before we were living in a private home. The Germans, we pay some rent a little bit. And I was working there for 3-4 months in Germany, in Munich, Germany. There's a little keller. They used to sell beer. And I worked there, and then I was good. So they say, I was making spaghetti and pizzas and everything else, but we're going to send you to Italy. They're going to pay for it, to school. I went over there, Modena, Italy. I was there for 3 months, I think. And I learned how to make sausage and spaghetti but it's not kosher. What are you going to do then? They don't have kosher pepperoni, but I ate that.
It's funny. Daddy we do a lot of research about the Holocaust together, and we actually found the restaurant he worked that's still around in Germany. What's it called again?
Munich, Germany, in Stiegelmeyer place. It's called Hofbräu.
And he said they were very nice to him after the war, and that's where they sent him. And luckily, that place. Maybe one day I'll go there and
80 years, who knows?
Yeah, and check it out.
I don't want to go. But it's very nice, and they send you they pay the trip and everything else. And I came back to it, and I didn't get to Israel. I went back. They hired me, but I didn't. And later I went to be my own businessman. And when I started a restaurant there in Munich, in Denver, I didn't know how to speak English. I didn't know scrambled eggs, poached eggs, and I had other troubles. And I married to my wife, and she taught me every word. Now my son-in-law, he tells me some words. So you have to do the best you can. I have a very nice son-in-law. This is my daughter's husband. Very good. Everything is okay. We thank God for that.
Absolutely. So let me ask you one more thing that's about preserving your family's history. You have photographs, and you seem to have retained some things. How were you able to keep those things, or did you get them after the war?
Go ahead.
We only have anything after the war. We have nothing from before the war. Like I said, there was a Polish family who kept a few things, and maybe one day I'll try to check that out and see if they have anything. But right now we don't have anything. We did have the picture of my dad and of him and his concentration camp clothes that the Russian lady had taken, a Russian officer had taken for him. And that's always been a big part of his life. And he was able to have a few artifacts that he bought after the war, but for the most part, we really don't have anything. We have nothing left except his memories. I did go back to Radomish Fialki. In fact, I did not show that in the program, but I did go back to Radomish Fialki. It was a very life-changing experience for me. And I learned a lot, and it was amazing to go back and see the town that my family was from.
If you will get sick, you think you have to wait till the next day because there's no hospitals, no doctors. It's a little town, 220 people. Mostly in town was living Jews. The Gentiles were living they will have farmers, you know, do things that, and that's all it is. We have to do what we can.
Is that how it is now, Lee? Is there not very much there when you visited? What were you able to see?
I didn't.
Well, you know,
I know you didn't go, Oscar. You said you would go back.
I think I might have some of the pictures in here. We'll show.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I know some people go back. Sometimes your children will go back when you won't go back.
No, Daddy will not go back. I did go back, and it's funny. I actually met an old lady there. I did a bunch of research before I went there, and I did find an older woman there who would have been about 2 or 3 years younger than Daddy at the time. And we asked her if she remembered the singers at all. And one thing she said is she said she did remember his sister with a lot of freckles. So, you know, they did. So she did remember her. And they told me that they had lived on the other side of the street. And I was so sure that they had lived by the cemetery. I did go to the cemetery, and I was able to go there, and she was right. Because when I came back, I asked Daddy, who never really told me where everything was, and he's always told me different stories because I don't think he ever really wanted me to go there. And when
the last 6 years, he said, "Can't you think you got to pick up me about?" I didn't want to go. Right. I don't want to see them.
So I did go back there, and so the lady was right, and actually that is where my family would have lived. And one day I am going to go back there, and I'm going to do a better job of trying to chronicle more of my family history.
There's nothing. Where the houses are, that's everything.
99% of everything was destroyed in the war. The only thing that was remained was the church. I think they did not. The Germans, when they retreated, they bombed the entire city.
All of the Jewish property.
And all the entire property.
Flea market.
Right, everything was ruined.
So that's all it goes. The things that you have to. But the way it goes, the life is like that. You have to go on with it. That's all.
You know, and I know that there are a lot of Holocaust deniers out there. However, there's a lot of wonderful German and Polish people that make films about the Holocaust and create artwork and coordinate efforts with survivors and service organizations and their families to help create a better world so that magnitude of hate and murder will never happen again. So children really aren't responsible for the sins of their fathers and mothers. And my dad taught me that every day really is a new day. And we do have a chance to make the world better one day at a time. And my dad always told me that hate will destroy the world, while love and forgiveness will change the world. And that's why we're really here to tell the story, because we really hope that love and forgiveness will change the world. And everything that your organization does, and organizations like you, to bring these type of stories to light and to force people to hear stories of survivors from many of these horrible things that happen, even from things that are happening today, make a difference in the world. And if you change one life, you're changing the world, and that's important.
Such an important message, and it definitely comes out of this story. And I thank both of you for giving people the opportunity to hear this story. Oscar, to hear your incredible story and to be inspired by your strength and your kindness.
My daughter, I gave it to her because I can talk. You know, it's just too hard for me to talk. Lots of times we watch shows from the Holocaust, from Auschwitz, really. But it's already 90 years old. I was right there, I was here. We look and she keeps me busy, so she shows me old pictures, and I even listen to old songs like Frank Sinatra, Don Rickle. I don't know if you know who that is, the real Sammy Davis Jr. That's all it is. You have to do what you can.
And I know that you're continuing the work that in Denver you spoke often about your experience.
Actually, he never did speak in Denver.
Is that so? Our understanding was always that he did.
No, he always refused to speak.
Because
he only spoke. My mother didn't want him to speak.
Crying.
Oh my!
Yeah, I'm sorry. So he actually never spoke before. It wasn't only until we contacted all of you, and we told you that is something we were interested in. And my mother was going to do that, and she died like a week later.
No, she did.
And I am a terrible speaker, and I hate being in front of people. But I decided that I was going to go ahead and do that because it was important, and it was important for people to hear. And no, we contacted you because we wanted, it was time. And that's, we
All the
decided it was
Holocaust
time.
at the Denver University, they had it over there. Holocaust for awareness, the Denver University. And then Schindler's List has the main picture.
Yes.
Which was one lady was talking. She had all marked
Oh, the
down
Spielberg
everything.
project, yes.
The Spielberg project and everything. But I never could talk because I started crying. The talking at the schools is very bad for me.
So now we know something that was already very special is even more special because
he marked down
people did not hear this before.
No.
And like Lee, thank you. Oscar, thank you. Like I said, the story has so many of just 9 lives at least, Oscar.
Well,
You lived 9 lives at least. And
we're doing it. We can forget these things there. It's a forgettable. It's happened in lots of places, but still not like that.
no, we need to remember, and survivors like you and sharing the story and Lee being sure that we heard the story. This was so important. I'm so grateful to both of you. I can't thank you enough.
Grateful for you and the
Very
work the
nice.
Holocaust Center does. Thank you very much.
They're doing pretty good since that's what I always join the meetings and things I want to come to.
And you bring so much. You bring so much to every meeting. So we're grateful to have you in Pittsburgh and to have you as part of our Generation series. Thank you both so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.